Okay, let's talk about internal validity today. So these are the terms that you have to know, and today we're going to talk about what internal validity is, and then basically going to talk about various threats to internal validity. Now, last time we talked about the characteristic of true experiments, and now all of these are kind of intended to establish cause and effect relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Okay. Okay, now internal validity really is when the researchers can say with confidence that the manipulation caused a control group to be different from the experimental group, or the control condition to be different from the experimental condition. So the extraneous variables are really any additional factors that the researchers did not intend but could be also contributing to the differences between the control group and experimental group. Right, so these are alternative explanations or alternative causes that can also cause the control group and experimental group to be different. Now, in the perfect experiment, what you want is you want to have the independent variable and only the independent variable to be responsible for the changes in dependent variable, right? Now, but the problem is that in reality, you have various extraneous variables that can also affecting the changes in your dependent variable. You can have you have so many other extraneous variables. So your job as an experimenter is to rule out all of these other extraneous variables, all of these other confoundings that can be responsible for all these changes for the independent variable. So in the most ideal way, you want to establish the link between the changes in the independent variable and the changes in the dependent variable. So this is why having a proper control is so important, because when you have control and when you hold the conditions constant, you are ruling out all of these other extraneous variables apart. Okay, so the example is that let's say if you have two plants that's going on, right? And then you are kind of wondering whether or not if sunlight can cause like these plants to grow well or not. All right, so what you did is that you are going to cover one of the plants up like this. All right, and after a while, then after two weeks later, and what you see is basically that the ones that receive the sun is looking pretty well, but the one that was covered up is all withered away. Well, then can you make the conclusion that it's because this plant is not getting the sun and therefore it kind of wither away? Well, that's what it seems like at the first place. But then when you kind of look in closer look, you can see that, well, let's say if this is getting covered up in the outside, the amount of the sun can be received by this black cover can cause like the temperature to go up, and that could be the temperature that is causing this plant to wither away because it's too hot, right? And another thing, you can also say that, well, it's because this whole plant that's being covered up is not getting any rainwater, and therefore it's because of the water that it's getting withered away. And you can also say that there can be other alternative explanation that is responsible to cause this plant to be different from this plant, right? So there are other alternative explanation other than getting the sunlight that's responsible for that. Okay, so it's really important to kind of rule out the explanations other than the one that you kind of intended. Now let's go back to our previous example. So is the lack of sunlight really the reason why the cover plant started dying? Well, you can say that, well, it's not getting any fresh air or the wind, and you can say that the temperature has gone too hot from the cover, that's receiving the light. And then you can also say that the amount of the water from the rain is different, and if there were any rainy days, right? So it's really important to have to establish the cause and effect of the relationship to kind of make sure that the study is internally valid. So for instance, what you can do is you don't have to use a cover, but you can just move this entire plant to in the shadow, but and that's inside, that's still receiving the sunlight, and you can do this in a temperature control, and you can make sure both plants are getting exactly the same amount of water to rule out all of these alternative explanations. And so to see really is this the effect of getting sunlight or not that is causing these two plants to look different. Okay, so that's basically that's the gist. Okay. So the type of control, which are the specific strategies to kind of make sure that the means are comparable at the start, you can use subject as their own control. We can use random assignment, something that we talked about last time, and then you can use matching, which involve previous tests. Okay, and another thing what you can do is you can build nuisance variables into experiments. So this is like a second independent variable that is independent from the first one, and then so this is not the same as a confounding variable. So let's say if you're kind of interested in knowing the effect of caffeine of reaction time, and but you're also kind of wondering if the male versus female can be like something that also impact that, because you're kind of thinking that maybe the way that male and female ingest coffee, their reaction is going to be different. Then what you can do is you can build a second nuisance variable such as gender of the participant into your experiment. And then later on, you can kind of tease them apart and saying that what is there a gender effect in there, or is there not a gender effect in there? Now, if there's no gender and the interaction effect, then you can pull the data together and so forth. Okay. Now, so there are some consideration of the internal validity, and so the first one is in testing the intact groups. The testing the intact group has so we're going to go each, and the second one is balancing the extraneous variables, and the third one is subject loss. Okay, and so let's talk about the testing the intact groups. So sometimes the random assignment is not possible due to pre-existing groups. So intact groups are basically, these groups are the ones that are formed at the start of the experiment. And so it's a bad it's a bad idea to test intact groups. And the reason for that is, so let's say a new professor has two teaching methods in mind. So there's teaching method A and teaching method B, and he is kind of interesting to know which one is more effective. And so he teaches two experimental psychology classes, not one at 8 a.m., another one at 8 p.m. And then, so with the flip of a coin, he decides to use method A on the 8 a.m. class, and the method B on the 8 p.m. class. And then, so at the end of the semester, he basically said that, oh, the morning class had a great average of this, and then the 8 p.m. class had an average of this, and then he concluded that method A is more effective. Well, there's a lot of problem to do it like this, so basically he's testing the intact groups, right? Because uh, he has made the assumption that group A and group B, or the 8 a.m. class and 8 p.m. class, are exactly the same in the beginning. But in reality, this is not the case, because you can kind of think about it in terms of the students' alert level at 8 a.m. versus 8 p.m. is going to be very different, right? And so that's the first reason. And the second possible reason is that students that are more likely to pay to pick the 8 a.m. class versus the students that more likely to pick the 8 p.m. class. They're also different kind of students. The ones that pick the 8 p.m. class, they might have to work during the day, and therefore they don't have so much time to devote to class, as opposed to day college students that they are they don't have any other works that they have to do during the day. They can only focus, focus only on the schoolwork. So there are various type of reasons why students that could contribute to all these different grade average of 89 versus 75, right? So, and it's not necessarily the teaching method, but rather it could be other explanations too, right? So therefore, this is not a very good idea to test intact groups that are, because you can kind of make the argument that, well, these are two different caliber of students, and these are two different type of students, and these are and even if these are two a same caliber student and the same type of student, their alertness level is not even the same, because 8 a.m., you're wide awake, as opposed to 8 p.m., all you want is you just want to go home and just kick back and rest. So even the attitude is very different. So you can see that it's so these you can so basically what I'm trying to say here is that there are alternative reasons why the students are performing very different in these two classes, and not necessarily due to his differences in the teaching methods. Okay. Okay. Now the second thing I kind of want to talk about is balancing extraneous variables. Okay. So what extraneous variables is something that we talked about. So these are the things that need to be controlled for in order to avoid the confounding. Right? And then so how do we kind of balance extraneous variables? So for instance, if the experimental group gets test administrator A and the control group gets test administrator B, and what's the problem here? Well, you can say that the differences between the control group and the experimental group could be because test administrator A versus test administrator B, right? And you can say that it could be because test administrator A is, let's say, more attractive and more pleasant and is always smiling. And this is caught, and as opposed to test administrator B, it was very grumpy and very serious and it never smiles. And so the way that they administer the test, the two groups makes the difference on the readout on the dependent variable. So that could be a problem. And the way that, how would you avoid this? Well, you can have half of the experimental group get administrator A and half of the experimental group gets administrator B, and same thing, and you do the same thing for the control group, and therefore half the experimental and half the control group, um, they get both experimental A and experimental B. And then so in this way, this effect gets balanced out. And then so you can just say that, well, this is not a real problem because experimental A and experimental B are 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 being presented to both control and the experimental group. So therefore, this is something that it can be avoided by doing so. Okay, so and now, so what you can do is something like the block randomization. Okay, so what you can have, let's say, for instance, you have you have John, Mike, May, Mary, and Perry that are in the control group, and you got Sue, Mark, Dylan, and Lyle in the experimental group, and then you can do this way. You can have block A that is being uh, tested by Aaron and Brian. Okay, and you can have block B that's being tested by Aaron and Brian, and so forth. So when you do this kind of block randomization, the strategy pretty much guarantees that each group will be tested by each tester. So in other words, the people who are so in other words, the people who are being exposed to the tester, it's balanced out within each group and also across group. Okay. And so now one of the things you kind of want to mention is that block randomization is going to reduce sensitivity. And that's because the participants respond to testers in different ways. So now what happened is that this is going to result in increased variability within groups. It's something that we talked about last time, right? And then and because this a person might kind of say, oh, okay, this tester is very serious. I better behave. Another person be like, and another person might respond to like a very stern and very serious person, be like, who does he think he is? And then have like a very negative effect on that. And another person might be like, oh, I kind of like the attitudes. They're very serious, very professional. So all of these people are going to respond in various ways. And then that just has to do with the way that you react uh, to a certain situation. And all of these different reactions or interactions with the experimenter, all of these is going to create variability within groups. And then you can see that this is going to make the data more heterogeneous. Right? Heterogeneous is meaning that you get a lot of variability in the data as opposed to be homogeneous. You get a lot of very tight internal consistencies within the data. Okay, now one of the things you kind of want to think about in terms of the block randomization, well, block randomization may increase in external validity, and that's because when you kind of think about it, if something is true that's being administered by Aaron, and then you can repeat this data that's being administered by Brian, and then just the two, and then when you look at the data and say, oh, we got the same effect when Aaron was a tester, we get the same effect when Brian was a tester. Well, what does that mean? That means that under whatever circumstances, even when you have different test administrators, you get the same results. Therefore, the generalizability of that also increased. Okay, so now there's something that I do want to bring up that if the significance is obtained in different groups, this kind of might have an issue in which that so let's say if you have when Brian was a tester, you found no significant difference, but when Aaron was a tester, you found a huge significant difference. What does that mean? That means that the way that they're administering the test is different, or it could be the people who are reacting to the way that they administer the test is also different. So now this is going to greatly reduce the internal validity because now you're like, well, I don't know whose data to believe. Do I believe Aaron's data or do I believe in Brian's data? Or I need to kind of have a better, tighter control when it comes to the way that the the test is being administrated. Maybe I should not have people administrate the data. Maybe I should have like a robot does it. Maybe I should have a recording does it. Something like that. That's going to minimize the amount of the reaction and differences in reaction from people and also from the people the or differences in the way that people perceive that these kind of reactions. So these are the ways that to kind of think about in terms of block randomization as well. Now, the third consideration for the internal validity is subject loss. Okay, so the subject loss is a huge problem in the sense that you can have mechanical subject loss or you can have selective subject loss. So there are two types, okay? So mechanical subject loss is the first type, and then so this is when the subject fails to complete the experiment because of the equipment failure. Okay, this happens sometimes. It's like today you are supposed to test the control group and the people who got there, and then all of a sudden there is a computer glitch, and then there was a power failure, and then you're like, okay, everybody just go home. And later on, so then later on, you're trying to get the same control people back. They're like, oh, I don't have time. This is the only time that I can really come in. And then therefore, the next time you were able to only recruit back, let's say 20% of the control group that you're supposed to have, then what happened is that you are down 80% of your control data, right? And so that's a mechanical loss. The second type of the subject loss is selective subject loss. And so this happens when the subjects are lost differentially across conditions. So you're thinking that, well, what do you mean loss differentially across conditions? So the easiest way to kind of think of that is that in the control group you didn't lose any subjects, but in the experimental group you lost like over 50% of your subjects, and this resulted in like unequal end across subjects. All right. So now, why is this such a big problem when it comes to internal validity? And it has to do with when some characteristic of the subject is responsible for the loss. So so what happens when a very specific characteristic is related to the independent variable or the dependent variable, the way that is used to assess the outcome of the study. So one of the example I kind of want to give you is the diet and exercise example. So let's say you are interested in knowing how doing CrossFit and plus weightlifting can lose like body fat. Okay, you're very interested in this. And so you have uh, two groups. All right, so you have the people. So in your control group, you just have them just do like very light exercises. You just kind of have them walk every other day for like 10 minutes. So that's a very easy exercise. And then in your experimental group, you have them do like 2 hours of weightlifting every day, and then every other day they have to do the CrossFit. They have to do like a very heavy circuit. They have to do battle rope. They have to do like burpees and all these horrible exercises that make their oxygen and VO max rate to be like 80 or above, something like really, really extreme, right? And then what happened is that this experimental group that which you have them work out for like 2 to 3 hours a day, at the end, well, they drop out from the study. They're like, I can't take this anymore. I can't do this for 3 months, right? And then as a result, you ended up with, let's say, 80% of your subject that dropped out from the studies. So, and let's say, and now you are left with only 20% who stay in the class, who stay in the study and who persevere through that, and then stayed, right? And then what the problem is that you don't know if the people who in the control study versus in the control group versus the people in the experimental group who persevere through all these diet and exercise regimen, are they different from are they different? Well, of course they're different, because so of course they're different, and the reason that they're different is because the people who persevered through this very vigorous diet and exercise regimen, their uh, personality is that one that will persevere from anything. But then the ones that are in the control group are really what? I mean, these are the people who would have persevered and plus the one that would have dropped out. Right? So then you see that subject loss, when you have selective subject loss, this is a real problem because now you have unequal people you have people with unequal amount of characteristics that are in both groups, and therefore you can say that their baseline in the very beginning are even to be different. So there is really no way for you to save this experiment, but there is the way that you could save the experiment is to have your control group that go through exactly the same regimen, okay, and see who dropped out and who don't, and only pick out those ones that stayed in the later exercise regimen and use the previous data when they're in the control group. This is the only way you can save the data when you have selective subject loss. Now let's talk about holding the conditions constant. So this is basically everything that you did to the experimental group, you have to do it to the control group. And then, now if you have various form of groups, let's say if you have a positive control, you have all these other control, you have to make sure that everything you did to accept the manipulation is exactly the same to all these different groups. So in lab setting, this is usually achieved by holding the conditions constant. So whatever that is done to group A is done to the group D, to the group B, to group C, to group D, and then everything is exactly the same except your intended manipulation. Okay, and so what happened is that if now in some rare group, some rare occurrences when the experimental group and the control group, if they have any sort of differences in the experience other than your manipulation, this then the history effect results. Okay, now let's talk about our 8 threats to internal validity. So each one is actually a real problem, and but each one is more applicable to a specific kind of design. So we're going to go through all of. All right, so in history, the effect of history is really kind of happens when the occurrence of one event other than the treatment can threaten the internal validity. So for instance, if you are trying to study on depression and then somebody's relative passed away, or if you're trying to study depression and then all of a sudden coronavirus hits the world. And so all of these historical things that is kind of like a very significant experiences, this can all affect the experimental outcome somehow, especially when you're studying psychology, right? And then so this can be usually eliminated in lab setting when you're trying to standardize or hold the conditions as constantly as much as possible. Now, history effect is going to be a real problem when you drag out your the length of your study. So let's say if you have a long-term study on the effect of vitamin D on depression. Well, if you are doing this kind of study and you have the participants taking vitamin D for like 1 year, well, then anything that from the start of the first day you start the experiment to like the day 365, when you end that experiment, anything that happened within this 1 year can be a history effect. So let's say, for instance, if someone that they love passed away, and this can be a huge effect on their happiness level, and therefore it is going to strongly affect their depression score, right? So this is something that history can really be an influence on the internal validity. Now, maturation is also another threat to internal validity, in which that subjects they are likely to grow old or sometimes they mature if you're studying children. And so all of these changes that associate with passage of time per se as maturation. Okay, and then how can you do to overcome this threat of internal validity? Well, you can do the counterbalancing technique in the within groups design if that's the case. But then if you just kind of looking at if your experiment is dragged out for a very long time, let's say a 5-year experiment, and there's no way to kind of to combat this effect of maturation other than to have like a matched control group that did not receive any treatment. So that's the only way to kind of go through this to rule out this effect of maturation. And the next one, so the example that I'm going to give you is that, let's say a researcher is interested in assessing children's learning over a school year using a new teaching method. So now, without a proper comparison, the researcher might attribute the changes in performance between a pre-test and a post-test of a group of school children to the effect of teaching intervention. But in reality, the changes were simply due to the normal processes of growing up. Right? So you can kind of say that, oh, this performance really the performance of the school children really did really well after this teaching intervention. But if you were to keep the same teaching method, because these children are just naturally growing up themselves, they might just be doing better all on their own. You don't know this, so this is consistent with the common phrase, "Oh, you grow out of like a phase," and which is true. People grow out of stuff like all the time just by the fact that they, let's say, puberty kicks in, or sexual maturation kicks in, all that stuff, and people do change a lot during these stages. So you have to also rule out the effect of maturation when you're looking at studies. So especially when the study is dragged out for like many years. Okay, now the third source of threats to internal validity is testing. So this is pretty much similar to what you guys did in your second second lab, looking at the practice effect, right? So after your second, after you had a previous test, your second test is better, right? So this is why, so this is the effect of testing. What you want to kind of say it as a practice effect. So this is especially problem with the one group pre-test, post-test design. So you, now you're probably kind of thinking that, well, so it seems like one group pre-test post-test design is a real problem. Well, so this is a one kind of repeated measures design, right? So this is a real problem in which that the each participant is giving a test before a treatment and then again after the treatment, and then to see if the treatment had an effect in the pre-test versus a post-test. Well, this is a real problem in the sense that um, there could be any effects of history, there could be effect of maturation, and there could be effect of the actual practice effect, right? So there are ways to kind of combat that, and so how would you do that? Well, so in normally in the pre-test post-test test design, what you have is before manipulation and after manipulation, and then anytime between this is the manipulation period, right? And then the researchers will compare the dependent variable value beforehand and after. And so what you are basically seeing is in this before manipulation and after manipulation period, and you see that there is a huge difference. And but then the problem really is this difference really due to the manipulation? And but you can also say that this can be a history effect, this could be a maturation effect, or this could be a testing effect, right? So how would you rule this out? Well, there are methods to kind of rule this out in ways that you can improve this type of design. And this is used something called a special mix kind of design, in which that you have group one that you use a placebo control group, and then group two you use an experimental group, and then you have both of these groups go through a manipulation period, and then you look at their performances between the control group and experimental group, right? Now, let's take a look at this. Right, so let's say if you have your control group before manipulation and after the manipulation, and basically you're not seeing that much differences, right? And then, but in the experimental group, they start this, you can see that in the control group and experimental, they start pretty similar, but then after the manipulation, you see a major difference in the control group versus the experimental group and after the manipulation period. So you can say unequivocally now that these differences after the manipulation in the control group versus the experimental group is because due to the manipulation and nothing else. It has nothing to do with history, it has nothing to do with maturation, it has nothing to do with testing. Okay, now, so in this case, you can see that because the control group pre-test and control group post-test is exactly the same, you can say that there is no maturation, there's no testing, and there's no history effect, right? And then now what happens if you see this kind of pattern data? You can say that, okay, so this is the differences between the control group and experimental group after the maturation. right? And so this means that there is a significant effect of whatever your manipulation that you are trying to do. But when you look at the differences between in the control group in the before manipulation and after manipulation, you can see there is a significant increase here. So this is the change that is due to history, due to maturation, and were due to testing. So when you incorporate this kind of special type of mixed design in the control group and experimental group, you can kind of say you can kind of get an idea what is there any kind of changes due to history, maturation, and wood testing effect. Okay, so now let's take a look at this example. Okay, so so basically this effect that you are seeing between the control group pre-test versus the control group post-test, what you're looking at, this effect is due to history, maturation, and or testing. And then when you're comparing this effect in the after maturation phase in the control group versus experimental group, this is the difference is due to manipulation. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about our fourth threat to internal validity, and this is instrumentation. So this is the change that can over time is not only due to the participants but also due to the instruments that's used to measure the participants' performance. So one of the very clear example is the use of observer rating. So now what happens is that when the observer gets more experience, their evaluation changes over time. So so the only way that you can do to overcome this type of internal validity problem is to overtrain the participants. Okay, and then if you're using some sort of instrumentation, then it's important to calibrate this very well every time you you do the measurement for real. So this is the only way that you can combat this a possible effect of instrumentation. Okay. And the next one is a regression towards the mean. So this only applies to extreme scores. So in which that imagine that if you got a perfect score, your GRE, and and let's say if you take it again, what's the likelihood that you're also going to get the perfect score on the GRE again, right? So you can see that there is a regression towards the mean just because this is such a extraordinary event that extremely to the left or extremely to the right, they have this tendency to gear back toward the mean, right? So because there is nowhere else to go but down, right? So this just has to do with the extremely good or bad performance is likely to be followed by by a performance that is not so good or not so bad. Right, so this is the regression towards the mean. This can also be a source of internal validity threat. Okay, now selection is has to do with when the two groups kind of differ even before the treatment was begin, before the treatment has started. Right, so then what happened is that selection is something that we kind of talked about in the previous studies when it comes to like that exercising and the diet study. So that is more like the subject loss and selection. Okay, now selection itself per se is that when you have two groups that the different even from the get-go. And the way that you would want to kind of combat this, overcome this threat to internal validity, one is you should do matching, another one is you should do random assignments. Okay, so now let's talk about subject mortality. So this is when the participants are lost from the experiment. And you can see that how this can be a major problem, not just to internal validity, but also to external validity. Because the way that subjects are lost, when you have more people in your study, the more generalizable of your outcome to the rest of the world, right? So you can see that this is not only a threat to internal validity, but also a threat to external validity as well. So the subject mortality is especially a problem when you have unequal subject loss from your experiment. So now when you kind of think about the previous uh, example on the subjects participating in the rigorous exercise, well, then what happened is that the subjects who are being subjected to very high intensity exercise, they cannot persevere through it, and then therefore they drop out from the study. And while there is a certain characteristic in the personality that make them remove themselves from the study. And then the issue is that now you're comparing um, uh, you're you're comparing people in this group that has a combination of all these personalities, comparing to these people um, that's persevere through this rigorous exercise. So regimen. And then the problem is you can see that this is an internal validity problem in which that, well, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges. Well, you're comparing apples and oranges to only apples. So this is a threat to internal validity, in the sense that now you have a very unequal personality characteristic across groups. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, sometimes you get subject mortality in the real sense that they really do drop dead from the experiment. So in the case of, let's say, cancer research, for instance, and sometimes, let's say, if you're doing some sort of aging research on very old people, let's say with Alzheimer's disease, or let's say a very very old generation of people, and sometimes they don't survive for a very long time, especially if your experiments a very long-term experiment, and so they literally drop dead from the experiment, and you're just gonna have to bite the bullet and say that, okay, this is just like the nature of the experiment, and then the only thing that you can kind of do is just to take all of the data that you could and just take that from it. So that is not so much of a issue when it comes to the internal validity. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. And this is the interaction with the selection. So sometimes you can have selection and history interaction problems. Sometimes you can have selection and maturation problem, and sometimes you can have a selection instrumentation problem. So basically, you can have selection history in which that you start with comparable groups, but then as something happened to one group but does not happen to the other, and so this will be the selection and the history effect. And sometimes you can have selection and maturation effect, and in which that you have two groups maturing at different rate. And another thing that you can have is like the ceiling and instrumentation effect, and this has to do with both the ceiling and the floor effect at the pretest. So the example that I kind of give you is that you picked the subjects based on their performance in a ridiculously easy test, and then everybody did really well, and therefore you thought that the two groups were comparable groups, but then this is not really the case. So let's say, for instance, you're kind of interested in knowing whether or not two teaching methods can make people at better at learning math in college level students, but then you kind of want to make sure that you have the two groups that you have are similar at the very start, and so therefore you give them an elementary score arithmetic test, and then everybody gets 100 in that. But if you were to give them a proper mathematical test in both groups, you might not have the same ability at the very start because you gave them a test that was too easy for any college student, basically. So that would be a selection and instrumentation effect, which is the interaction with the selection. Okay, so basically, whenever you have a selection effect, this is something that the two groups are not comparable to start with. And whenever you have an interaction with selection effect, is the selection effect, they might seem to start equally in the beginning, but then either due to history, maturation, or instrumentation interaction, they are accelerating, they're developing at different stages. They're different, the way that they are growing or maturing or the experiencing are all different. And therefore, all of that will kind of fall into the category with interactions with the selection effect. Okay, that's it, folks. I hope that you guys have a good weekend and stay safe. And definitely wash your hands often and try not to touch your face or touch your nose. Okay, and if there are any questions, you can post them on discussion board or you can bring them out during the Zoom meeting. Okay, have a safe weekend. Bye bye.